Chapter 2. Survey of the Documents. Travelers, Merchants, and Envoys. Professor Leo Frobenius was a pioneering German Africanist. Writing in the earlier part of the 20th century, he produced several highly original volumes on early African history. Most have remained in the original German, but a few were translated into French. One such work was Histoire de la Civilisation Africaine, which appeared in 1936. It contains a splendid summary of what the earlier European merchants, travelers, and explorers saw when they visited Africa 500 years ago. When they arrived in the Gulf of Guinea and landed at Veda in West Africa, the captains were astonished to find streets well laid out, bordered on either side for several leagues by 2 rows of trees. For days they traveled through a country of magnificent fields, inhabited by men clad in richly colored garments of their own weaving. Further south in the kingdom of the Congo, a swarming crowd dressed in silk and velvet, great states, well ordered, and down to the most minute details, powerful rulers, flourishing industries, civilized to the marrow of their bones, and the condition of the countries on the eastern coast, Mozambique, for example, was quite the same. All very impressive, tree-lined streets, large farms, textiles, industries, silk and velvet, etc. But how did the professor know any of this? Where is his evidence? How can we moderns check that this is indeed a fair picture of what the early travelers saw? And what they told, says Frobenius, those old captains, those chiefs of expeditions, the Delabes, the Desmarches, the Pigafettas, and all others, what they told is true. It can be verified. In the old Royal Kunstkammer of Dresden, in the Wiedemann collection of Ulm, and many other European curiosity cabinets, one still finds collections of objects from West Africa dating from that epoch. Wonderful plush velvets of extreme softness made from the tenderest leaves of a certain banana tree. Stuffs, soft and pliant, brilliant and delicate as silks, woven with well-prepared raffia fibre, ceremonial javelins, their blades to the very points inlaid with the finest copper, bows so graceful and ornamented so beautifully that they would do honor to any museum of arms whatsoever. Calabashes decorated with the most perfect taste, sculpture in ivory and wood, the workmanship of which reveals skill and style. One of the sources Dr. Frobenius alluded to was that of the Filipino Pigafetta. His History of Kingdom of Congo was published in Rome in 1591. He based it on the first-hand information supplied to him by the slave trader Duarte Lopez. The trader had sailed to the Congo far down to the West African coast in April 1578. Master Abraham Hartwell made an English-language translation of Pigafetta's work in 1597. Thomas Fowle Buxton made a modern translation in 1881. Pigafetta informs us that the Kingdom of Congo measured 1,685 miles in circumference and was divided into 6 administrative provinces. The capital city, Banza Congo, lay in the province of Pemba. It had a population of over 100,000 people and was already cosmopolitan. Some Portuguese lived there. Moreover, Christianity had spread to the region. The Congolese king, Zinga Kuwu, had been baptized and appears in Pigafetta's account under the Portuguese baptismal name of Dom Afonso. Modern scholars, however, identified the king as Dom Yoa I. According to Pigafetta, Banza Congo was open to the south. It was Dom Afonso, i.e. Zinga Kuwu, the first Christian king, who first surrounded it with walls. He reserved for the Portuguese a place also surrounded by walls. He also had his palace and the royal houses enclosed, leaving between these 2 enclosures a large open space where the main church was built. A square was left in front of it. The doors of their aristocratic homes and of the houses of the Portuguese face walls of the church. At the entrance of the square, a few great lords of the court have their homes. Behind the church, the square ends in a narrow street provided with a gate. When you walk through this gate, you find a great many houses to the east. Outside the walls which surround the royal residences and the Portuguese town, there are numerous buildings belonging to various lords, each of whom occupies whatever location pleases him, so he can live near the court. It was impossible to determine the area of this town outside the 2 enclosures, since all of the countryside is filled with royal houses and palaces. Each lord with his group of habitations encloses a little village. The circumference of the Portuguese town measures about a mile, and that of the royal quarter as much. At night the gates are not closed or even guarded. The Portuguese sailed around the tip of South Africa in 1499 and landed in the vast empire of Numidia. Benin Tepa in some of the Portuguese accounts, they described it as vast gold reserves, ivory trade, and curious architecture. The empire itself ruled the modern territories of Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and parts of South Africa. Assisting the administration was a sizable bureaucracy financed by taxation, tribute, and presents. The royal family and their officers used most of the bounty, but a portion of it went to social welfare. Antonio Boccaro, a Portuguese contemporary, informs us that the emperor shows great charity to the blind and maimed, for these are called the king's poor, and have land and revenues for their subsistence, and when they wish to pass through the kingdoms, wherever they come, food and drinks are given to them at the public cost as long as they remain there. And when they leave that place to go to another, they are provided with what is necessary for their journey, and a guide, and someone to carry their wallet to the next village. In every place where they come, there is the same obligation, under penalty that those who fail therein shall be punished by the king. In the 1520s, Francisco Alvarez, a Portuguese friar, visited Ethiopia. In 1542, he published his report on the country as Verdadeira Informação das Terras de Preste Yom. From his account, we learn that the Portuguese sent him there on a mission to convert the Ethiopians to Roman Catholic Christianity. The Ethiopians were already Christians, but they observed Coptic Christianity. On his visit, the Portuguese missionary saw the Ethiopian city of Lalibela. The city contained 11 underground churches. Clearly flabbergasted by their workmanship and ingenuity, Alvarez was worried that his fellow Portuguese citizens were not going to believe his account of the city. He wrote, "I swear by God, in whose power I am, that all that is written is the truth. And there is much more than I have already written, and I have left it out that they may not tax me with its being falsehood." In 1602, Peter de Moray's description of Guinea was published. It contained his first-hand accounts of various travelers to Africa and what they found. Derek Reuters, a Dutch visitor, wrote one such account. He entered Benin City in what is now southern Nigeria and reported that at first the town seems to be very large. When one enters it, one comes into a great broad street which appears to be 7 or 8 times broader than the Warm Street in Amsterdam. This extends straight out, and when one has walked a quarter of an hour along it, he still does not see the end of the street. The houses in this town stand in good order, one close to one another, like houses in Holland. In 1817, Thomas Bowditch, an Englishman, visited the Shanghai Empire in what is now Ghana and Ivory Coast. Sent an official business by the British government, his book, Mission from Cape Coast Castle to Ashanti, was published in 1819. It contains a vivid account of his impressions on entering Kumasi, the capital city. We entered Kumasi at 2 o'clock. Upwards of 5,000 people, the great part warriors, met us with awful bursts of martial music. Smoke, which encircled us from the incessant discharges of musketry, confined our glimpses to the foreground. The dress of their captains was a war cap with gilded ram's horns projecting in front. The sides extended beyond all proportion by immense plumes of eagle's feathers. Their vest was of red cloth covered with fetishes, i.e. symbols and saphis in gold and silver. They wore loose cotton trousers with immense boots of dull red leather coming halfway up the thigh. The king, his tributaries, and captains were resplendent in the distance and surrounded by attendants of every description. At least 100 large umbrellas or canopies, which could shelter 30 persons, were sprung up and down the bearers with brilliant effect, being made of scarlet yellow and the most showy cloths and silks, and crowned on the top with crescents, pelicans, barrels, and arms and swords of gold. Babaches, as did their superior captains and attendants, wore Ashanti cloths of extravagant price from the costly foreign silks which had been unraveled to weave them in all varieties of color, as well as pattern. These cloths were of incredible size and weight, and thrown over the shoulder exactly like a Roman toga. A small silk fillet generally encircles their temples, and massy gold necklaces intricately wrought. In 1822, Captain Clapperton and 2 of his colleagues set off across the Sahara from the Mediterranean coast. Traveling through what was the Kanem-Borno Empire, they headed for the Sokoto Caliphate of northern Nigeria. Arriving there in 1824, they met the Sultan at the royal residence in the city of Gobir. The particulars, including meat and salt and bellow, were published in 1826 under the name Narrative of Travels and Discoveries in Northern and Central Africa. March 17th, wrote Clapperton. After breakfast, the Sultan sent for me. His residence was at no great distance. In front of it, there is a large quadrangle, into which several of the principal streets of the city led, and we were immediately ushered into the presence of Bello, the second Sultan of the Felatas, i.e. Fulani. He was seated on a small carpet between two pillars supporting the roof of a thatched house, not unlike one of our cottages. The walls and pillars were painted blue and white in the Moorish taste, and on the back wall was sketched a fire screen, ornamented with a coarse painting of a flower pot. An armchair with an iron lamp standing on it was placed on each side of the screen. The Sultan bade me many hearty welcomes and asked me if I was not much tired. The English sent yet another fact-finding mission into West Africa. Led by the meticulous German Dr. Henry Barth, the findings were published between 1857 and 1858. 5 large scholarly volumes were issued entitled Travels and Discoveries in North and Central Africa. During his travels, word reached by Dr. Barth that an African historian in the 1600s had already mapped the early history of the region. The book, Tariq-e-Sudan, was still in circulation, if only one could get one's hands on it. I passed the time during my residence in this place, Gondo, not quite uselessly, wrote Dr. Barth, especially as I was so fortunate as to obtain here from a learned man of the name of Bokhari, a son of the late Muhammad Wani, a copy of the most valuable historical work, to which my friend Abd el-Kadir in Sokoto, in northern Nigeria, had first called my attention. I spent 3 or 4 days most pleasantly in extracting the more important historical data of this work, which opened to me quite a new insight into the history of the regions of the middle course of Niger, exciting in me a far more lively interest than I had previously felt in a kingdom the greater power of which, in the former times, I here found set forth in very clear and distinct outlines. William Winwood Reade wrote The Martyrdom of Man in 1872. It is a strange but beautifully written text that attempts to show that Africa was never far from the mainstream of history. Among other things, Reade wrote an admirable summary of what Captain Clapperton and his 2 colleagues witnessed when they visited Kanem-Borno and northern Nigeria. Denham and Clapperton were astonished to find among the Negroes magnificent courts, regiments of cavalry, the horses caparisoned in silk for the gala days and clad in coats of mail for war, long trains of camels laden with salt and natron and corn and cloth and cowrie shells, which form the currency, and the kola nuts, which Arabs call the coffee of the Negroes. They attended with wonder to the gigantic fairs at which the cotton goods of Manchester, the red cloth of Saxony, double-barrel guns, razors, tea and sugar, Nuremberg ware, and writing paper were exhibited for sale. They also found merchants who offered to cash their bills, i.e. checks, upon houses at Tripoli, and scholars acquainted with Avicenna, Averroes, and the Greek philosophers. The Hon. A. Wilmot, then a member of the Legislative Council of the Cape of Good Hope, wrote Monomotapa, Its Monuments and Its History. Published in 1896, it was the first modern synthesis of documents concerning the early history of the Munhumatapa Empire. Though far from perfect, Mr. Wilmot presented enough source material to have allowed later historians to write a balanced history of the region. We have extracted the following from this work. In the historical description of the most wonderful countries of the world by Johnstone, published in 1603, we are supplied with a fair summary of what could be learned from Portuguese writers. He tells us that in the residue of Ethiopia, i.e. Africa, reigned divers, i.e. many, powerful princes as the kings of Adel, Monomugi, Monomotapa, Angola, and Congo. Monomotapa, i.e. Munhumatapa, is mightier and more famous than the rest. This kingdom containeth all that island, which lieth between the river of Kwama, i.e. Zambezi, and Spirito Santo, i.e. Limpopo, a territory of 150 leagues in compass. and from Espírito Santo it stretches to the Cape of Good Hope, i.e. southern tip of South Africa. For the viceroys of that huge tract do acknowledge him for their sovereign and superior governor. The soil aboundeth with corn and cattle. By the store of teeth, i.e. ivory, not less than 5,000 elephants must die yearly. Zimba, i.e. Great Zimbabwe, and Benamarxa, i.e. Kami, are cities. There is no climate like it for plenty of gold, for by report there is 3,000 miles whereout gold is digged. Gold is likewise found in the earth, in rocks, and in rivers. The mines of Manica, Boro, Kutiki, and Toto, which some men call Batwe, are the richest. The people are mean of stature, black, and well set. They converse with the king kneeling. The offences most punished are witchcraft, theft, and adultery. The king beareth on his coat of arms a certain little spade with an ivory handle, and 2 small darts. He keepeth for his faithfulest guard 200 dogs. He keepeth the heirs of the vassal princes to be secured of their father's loyalty. Major Dubois, a French scholar, synthesized that Tariq-et-Soudan with a travelogue to produce the first modern account of the Shanghai Empire of West Africa. His Timbuktu the Mysterious appeared in New York in 1896 and London the following year. As my boat approaches, the banks and walls of the city of Guinea and Mali emerge in greater proportions from encircling water. At their feet I can distinguish a harbor filled with large boats that have nothing in common with the accustomed pirogue. They are large and strange in form, like the city that shelters them. When I climb the banks and enter the walls, my surprise takes a definite form. I am completely bewildered and thrown out of reckoning by the novelty and strangeness of the town's interior. Surely the angel of Habakkuk has suddenly transported me 1,000 leagues away from the Sudan, i.e. Africa. For it is not in the heart of the country of eternally similar huts, childish in their simplicity and confusion, that I should look to find a real town. Yes, a real town in the European sense of the word, not one of those disorderly conglomerations of dwellings in which we call towns in this country.
Here were true houses, not primitive shelters crowned with roofs that are either flat or in the shape of an inverted funnel. Streets, too, not sea plots of buildings amongst which one wanders by paths that serpentine more than the most serpentine serpent. The idea suddenly occurs to me, perhaps this is Timbuktu, after all. This would explain everything, but it is impossible. The Bosos say we are still 12 days' journey distant from there. What is this town, then? With its wide, straight roads, its houses of 2 stories, some with a sketch of a third, built in a style that instantly arrests the eye. I am completely bewildered. Where did this gathering of unknown life come from? What is this civilization sufficiently assured to possess a manner of style of its own? The Shanghai Empire flourished in the 15th and 16th centuries. A vast imperial system, it encompassed parts of the territories now called Mali, Mauritania, Niger, northern Nigeria, Guinea, Senegal, and Gambia. In 1903, H. Ling Roth wrote Great Benin, Its Art, History, and Horrors. This work was the first modern account of the Nigerian civilization of Benin. The author, much like Wilmot, presented a great deal of raw material that could have allowed later historians to write a full history of the region. Mr. Roth gave his reasons for writing the book as follows. At the time of the destruction of the city of Great Benin by the British in 1897, we seem to know very little about the city or the country, but its capture caused us to seek out what had once been known and long since forgotten. Thus, by 1903, the student of black history had 3 important works to draw upon, each containing a wealth of primary source material. Quite apart from this literature, however, another branch of historical research had produced important and relevant results. Orientalist scholarship. Count de Volney is, perhaps, best known for the Ruins or Meditations on the Revolutions of Empires and the Law of Nature. Written in 1791 and enlarged in 1794, this book launched Orientalism, a whole new scholarly arena. Prior to this work, the Bible was considered the final word on ancient history in academic circles. The Count demonstrated that Christianity and all other later religions could be traced back to early astronomical ideas based on the zodiac. Destroying the biblical chronology, de Volney declared the Negroes in ancient Egypt and in the Sudan pioneered the study of the zodiac thousands of years ago. Moreover, Africans started civilization. The father Orientalism wrote, "We have the strongest reasons to believe that the country neighboring to the tropic, i.e. Sudan and southern Egypt, was the cradle of sciences, and of consequence that the first learned nation on earth was a nation of blacks. For it is incontrovertible that by the term Ethiopians, the ancients meant to represent a people of black complexion, thick lips, and woolly hair. I am therefore inclined to believe that the inhabitants of Lower Egypt, i.e., the northern Mediterranean coast, were originally a foreign colony imported from Syria and Arabia, a medley of different tribes of savages, originally shepherds and fishermen, who, by degrees formed themselves into a nation, and who, by nature or descent, were enemies of the Thebans, i.e. the southern black capital, now the ruined city of Karnak, by whom they were no doubt despised and treated as barbarians. I have suggested the same ideas in my travels into Syria, founded upon the black complexion of the Sphinx. I have since ascertained that the antique images of Thebes, i.e. the old pharaonic sculptures in Thebes and Karnak, have the same characteristic, and Mr. Bruce has offered a multitude of analogous facts." The father of Orientalism was, however, heavily influenced by the earlier research of his countryman M. Charles Dupuis. M. Dupuis, the French savant, published his memoirs on the origin of the constellations and on the explanation of the fable by astronomy in 1781. He expanded this work into the 12-volume The Origin of All Religious Worship in 1794. In 1798, he abridged the 12-volume book into a 1-volume popular work. In 1872, an English-language translation of the 1-volume abridgment was published in the United States and was entitled The Origin of All Religious Worship. In this work, of the most profound scholarship, M. Dupuis shows that the veneration of the sun, moon, and other natural phenomena was and still is the foundation of all subsequent religions. This cultural ideas began in Africa and spread to other parts of the world. The Ethiopians, i.e. Sudanese, the fathers of the Egyptians, living in a burning climate, worshipped nevertheless the divinity of the sun, but above all that the moon, which presided over the nights, the sweet coolness of which made them forget the heat of the day. All the Africans offered sacrifices to these great divinities. It was in Ethiopia, i.e. Sudan, where the famous table of the sun was found, the same as the Incas of Peru. They called themselves children of the sun, which they regarded as their first progenitor. The troglodytes, i.e. of the Sahara, had a fountain dedicated to the star of day. In the neighborhood of the temple of Amun, there was a rock, sacred to the south wind, and a fountain of the sun. The Blemis, situated on the confines of Egypt and Ethiopia, immolated human victims to the sun. The rock of Bahia and the island of Nassala, situated beyond the territory of Ethiopia, i.e. the Sahara, was dedicated to the same luminary. The divinities which were invoked as witnesses in the treaty of the Carthaginians, i.e. of Tunisia, with Philip the son of Demetrius, were the sun, moon, the earth, the rivers, the prairies, and the water. Massinissa, a king of Numidia, see below, in thanking the gods on the arrival of Scipio in his empire, addresses himself to the sun. The natives of the island of Socotora, i.e. near Yemen, and the Hottentots, i.e. of South Africa, preserve to this day, i.e. in 1798 A.D., the ancient veneration which the Africans had always had for the moon, which they regard as the principle of sublunary vegetation. They applied to her when they wanted rain, sunshine, or good crops. She is to them a kind and beneficent divinity, such as was Isis with the Egyptians. All the Africans who inhabit the coast of Angola and of the Congo worship the sun and the moon. The natives of the island of Tenerife worship them also, as well as planets and other stars on the arrival of the Spaniards. Count de Volney and M. Dupuis began a reassessment of the early Greek and Roman sources, the oldest corpus of literature produced by Europeans. Herodotus, an ancient Greek historian, is also called the father of history. While he did not pioneer the subject, he was the first European to write a history book that has come down to us today. Writing in around 450 BC, he synthesized historical material collected during visits to various countries, but much of what he wrote came from memory. Herodotus, as he himself admits, took few notes. In Egypt, his information came from the priests who told him particulars on some of the most important pharaohs. Setmen, i.e. Minna, was the first king of Egypt. Next they read for me the papyrus the names of 330 monarchs, who, they said, were the successors upon the throne. In this number of generations there were 18 Ethiopian, i.e. Sudanese, kings, and one queen who was a native. All the rest were kings and Egyptians. Manetho, writing in around 240 BC, was an Egyptian priest from the city of Heliopolis. During this time, Egypt was under the imperial rule of the Greeks. The Greek monarch, Ptolemy Philadelphus, commissioned him to compile a full history of Egypt from the earliest times to the Greek conquest. This great work is now lost, but later historians quoted from it. Josephus, the Roman Jewish historian, quotes an excerpt that reads as follows: "A blast of God smote us, and unexpectedly from regions of the east, invaders of obscure race marched in confidence of victory against our land. By main force they easily seized it without striking a blow, and having overpowered the rulers of the land, they then burned our cities ruthlessly, and treated all the natives with cruel hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others. Finally, they appointed as king one of their number, whose name was Salatus." Contrary to Herodotus, not all the pharaohs were Egyptians or Sudanese. Some were Asians from the east. It is possible that the priests that Herodotus spoke to omitted these foreigners from the papyrus scroll. Josephus, who quoted the above passage, identifies these invaders as the children of Israel. They conquered Egypt and ruled as the 15th and 16th dynasties. If Josephus is correct in the assertion, the Old Testament is largely, if not completely, erroneous. Plutarch was a Greek scholar of the late 1st century AD. He was interested in religious matters and wrote a brilliant and penetrating account of Egyptian philosophical and religious culture. This work, concerning Isis and Osiris, drew heavily on Egyptian source material, especially the writings of Manetho. Plutarch shows that the ancient Greek scholars were very interested in Egyptian thought and studied it firsthand from the priests of Egypt. The Greek scholars apparently visited the Egyptian cities of Memphis, Sai, Heliopolis in order to study. The most wise of the Greeks are also witnesses: Solon, Thales, Plato, Exodus, Pythagoras, and some say Lycurgus as well, through coming to Egypt and associating with her priests. And so they say that Exodus was hearer of Choneuphis of Memphis, and Solon of Sonkai of Say, and Pythagoras of Eunuphus of Heliopolis, and the last especially, as it appears, being contemplated and contemplating, brought back to the memory of his men, i.e. the Greeks, their, i.e. the Egyptians, symbolic and mysterious art, containing their dogmas and dark sayings. For most part of the Pythagorean messages leave out nothing of what are called the hieroglyphic letters. Diodorus Siculus was another outstanding Greek historian of antiquity. In the 1st century BC, he wrote General History, an encyclopedic work on world history. These volumes demonstrate the state of historical knowledge in Diodorus' time. We have extracted the following account of human origins. Now the Ethiopians, i.e. Africans, as historians relate, were the first of all men, and the proofs of this statement, they say, are manifest, for that they did not come into their land as immigrants from abroad, but were natives of it, and so justly bear the name of stones, i.e. sprung from the soil itself is. They maintain, conceded by practically all men, furthermore, that those who dwell beneath the noonday sun were, in all likelihood, the first to be generated by the earth, is clear to all, since, inasmuch as it was the warmth of the sun which, the generation of the universe, dried up the earth when it was still wet, and impregnated it with life, it is reasonable to suppose that the region which was nearest to the sun was the first to bring forth living creatures. It is astonishing to note just how modern these ideas are. It is now generally accepted that Africa is the cradle of the human race. This is discussed in some detail in Chapter 5. Carthage and Numidia were two important civilizations in North Africa in the regions now called Tunisia and Algeria. Most of what we know about these states come from what the Greek and Roman writers have recorded on their behalf. Massinissa, 238 to 149 BC, was king of Numidia during the Punic Wars. Polybus, a Roman author, recorded the following about the distinguished man. Massinissa was the greatest and the happiest sovereign of her epoch. He reigned more than 60 years in perfect health. Physically, he was the strongest and most robust man of his time. Thanks to the harmony that reigned in his family, his kingdom was never troubled by intrigue or domestic strife. But this was his greatest merit, his most admirable work. Before him, Numidia was wild, uncultivated, and alien to all culture. He was the first to show that it could produce all kinds of fruit like any other country. He has, therefore, more title and rights than anyone that his memory should be honored. Mr. Bosworth Smith was the English author of Carthage and the Carthaginians. Writing in 1877, he penned a detailed account of the North African culture. He relies on the Greek and Roman source material because no native poet whose writings have come down to us has sung of the origin of Carthage or of her romantic voyages. No native orator has described in glowing periods which we can still read the splendor of her buildings and the opulence of her merchant princes. No native annalist has preserved the story of her long rivalry with the Greeks and Etruscans, and no African philosopher has moralized upon the stability of her institutions or the causes of her fall. All have perished. Strabo was an ancient geographer. He suggested that very early Greek sources indicate that Ethiopians, that is, black people in general, used to inhabit a wide stretch of ancient world, not just Africa, in his own words. I assert that the ancient Greeks, in the same way as they classed all northern nations, which they were familiar as Scythians, etc., so I affirm they designated as Ethiopia the whole of the southern countries towards the ocean. If the moderns, i.e. in Strabo's time, had confined the appellation Ethiopians to those who dwell near Egypt, i.e. Sudan, this must not be allowed to interfere with the meaning of the ancients. Professor Arnold H. L. Hereen, a German historian, was the author of historical researches into the politics, intercourse, and trade of the Carthaginians, Ethiopians, and Egyptians. Translated into English in 1832, this two-volume work summarized the known data of Carthage, Nubia, and Egypt. Furthermore, herein developed a theory that black people in Africa and early Western and Southern Asia pioneered civilization by establishing the first trading networks. Concerning the distribution of these early black peoples, Professor Heron wrote that all those who were strikingly distinguished from Europeans by a very dark or completely black skin received the general appellation of Ethiopians. After these remarks, it will not seem strange that we find Ethiopian nations scattered over a great part of the ancient world. Africa certainly contained the greatest number of them, yet they were not the only inhabitants of this part of the world, nor were they confined to it alone. A considerable tract of Asia was occupied by an Ethiopian race, and the term India was often made to comprise southern Africa. So, in like manner, the term Ethiopia is frequently made to include southern India. The notion that Negroes once occupied India and a considerable tract of Asia may seem unusual, but it is not without corroboration. Many other scholars have pointed out the same fact. Godfrey Higgins, an English magistrate, wrote Anacalypsis in 1836. The subtitle to this two-volume masterpiece is an attempt to draw aside the veil of the Saitic Isis. Of astonishing erudition, Mr. Higgins attempted to trace the origin of nations, languages, and religions. Moreover, he synthesized the research of English Orientalists, led by Sir William Jones, with those of the French Orientalists, led by Count de Volney. The following excerpt is representative of his findings. No person who has considered well the character of the temples in India and Egypt can help being convinced of the identity of their character, and of their being the production of the same race of people, and the race evidently Ethiopian. Sphinxes of Egypt have all Ethiopian, i.e. Negro faces. The bust of Memnon, i.e. Pharaoh Amenhotep III, in the British Museum is evidently Ethiopian. The worship of the mother and child is seen in all parts of the Egyptian religion. It prevails everywhere. It is the worship of Isis and the infant Horus, i.e. Horus, or Osiris. It is the religious rite prohibited at Rome, but which prevailed in spite of all opposition, as we find from the remaining ruins of its temples. It was perhaps through its country, Egypt, that the worship of the Black Virgin and Child came into Italy, where it still prevails. It is the worship of the god Yahweh, the Savior, Bacchus in Greece, Adonis in Syria, Krishna in India, coming into Italy through the medium of the two Ethiopians, i.e. Egypt and India. She was, as the Ethiopians were, black, and such she still remains. After 1821, Egyptology became a separate subject among the Orientalist disciplines. M. Jean-François Champollion founded the discipline by being the first to decipher the hieroglyphic script. The father of Egyptology, however, failed to write a proper book on the subject of Egypt. He did, however, write a series of letters on his findings. His brother published these in 1839 under the title Egypt Asian. In modern times, Egypt has three main populations: the ruling Arabs, the Copts, and the Nubians. The Copts, a relatively light-skinned population, are often presented as descendants of pharaohs because their language, used in church services, is closest to ancient Egyptian. The father of Egyptology refuted this view because the ancient Egyptians belonged to a race quite similar to the Canaanites or Barabras, present inhabitants of Nubia. In the present Copts of Egypt, we do not find any of the characteristic features of the ancient Egyptian population. The Copts are the result of crossbreeding with all the nations that have successfully dominated Egypt, i.e. the Greeks and Romans. It is wrong to seek in them the principal features of the old race. By the 1850s, a new discipline had emerged among the Orientalists called Assyriology, focusing on the Western Asian territories of Iraq, Iran, and Syria. Sir Henry Rawlinson founded the discipline. He was the first modern scholar to decipher cuneiform, the long-dead script used by the ancient civilizations of the region. The Sumerians were the first civilized culture in the Middle East and the pioneers of cuneiform, followed by the Akkadians, the Babylonians, Assyrians, and the Chaldeans. Deciphering cuneiform was an important achievement, but like Champollion before him, however, the father of Assyriology failed to write a proper book on the subject. His younger brother, Professor George Rawlinson of Oxford University, presented his findings in his own works. Sir Henry wrote on the early history of Babylonia as a supplementary essay to one of George Rawlinson's books. From this essay, we cite the following. In regard to the language of the primitive Babylonians, i.e. Sumerians, although in its grammatical structure it resembles dialects of the Turanian family, the vocabulary is rather Cushite or Ethiopian, belonging to that stock of tongues which in the sequel were everywhere more or less mixed up with the Semitic languages, but of which we have probably the purest modern specimens in the Mahara of southern Arabia and the Gala of Absentia, i.e. Ethiopia. Cushite or Ethiopian languages originated in East Africa. Sir Henry theorized that the Sumerians evolved there and migrated to Iraq in prehistoric times through southern Arabia. Darwin, the father of natural selection theory, wrote The Descent of Man. This 1871 work contained the first ever attempt to apply natural selection theories to the origin of humanity. One of the topics Darwin discussed was on the birthplace and antiquity of man. This section begins as follows. We are naturally led to inquire, where was the birthplace of man? In each great region of the world, the living mammals are closely related to the extinct species of the same region. It is therefore probable that Africa was formerly inhabited by extinct apes closely related to the gorilla and chimpanzee. And as these two species are now man's nearest allies, it is somewhat more probable that our early progenitors lived on African continent than elsewhere. That same year, Philip Smith wrote an instructive text called The Ancient History of the East. This work, also entitled The Student's Ancient History, shows just how much of the cutting-edge research had made its way into the mainstream of British scholarship. In an early chapter, Mr. Smith assures us that 4 races are thus distinguished: the white or Caucasian, the yellow or Mongolian, the black, Negro or Negritian, and the red or American. The first was the sole possessor of ancient civilization. The second appears only occasionally on the scene of ancient history, when its nomad hordes came down from their homes in the plateau of Central Asia, over which they have always wandered. The third is only represented by the slaves depicted on Egyptian monuments. The fourth does not yet appear at all. I'll not leave the issue there, concerning the ancient Egyptians. If we were left to form an opinion upon this subject by the description of the Egyptians left by the Greek writers, we would conclude that there were, if not Negroes, at least closely akin to the Negro race. That they were much darker than the neighboring Asiatics, that they had hair frizzled either by nature or by art, that their lips were thick and projecting, and their limbs slender, rests upon the authority of eyewitnesses who have traveled in the country and who could have no motive to deceive. But the vast majority of the mummies are those of the native Egyptians, and their osteological characters prove that they belong to the Caucasian and not to the African race. The monuments and paintings, however, show that the Egyptians possessed a peculiar physiognomy, differing from both races, approaching more nearly to the Negro type than to any other of the Caucasian races. The fullness of the lips, seen in the Sphinx of the pyramids and in portraits of the kings, is characteristic of the Negro, and the elongation of the eye is a Nubian peculiarity. Conclusion. New light has recently been thrown upon the whole subject by M. Mariette's discovery, in the northeasternmost part of Egypt, of a race of men of a type quite different from Egyptians, both ancient and modern, who seem to represent a more ancient population. The distinct separation of classes, though it be incorrect to term them as castes, is an indication that the dominant Egyptians had overcome a previous population, and it now appears that there was such a population more nearly approaching the African type, but decidedly not Negro. The only conclusion that one can draw is that Negroes occupy the top caste, as presented by the Sphinx in the royal portraiture. The lower castes were comprised of populations more nearly approaching the African type, but decidedly not Negroes, and also Caucasians, as represented by the mummies. Concerning the Sumerians of Iraq, founders of the first civilization in Asia, Mr. Smith describes them thus. The seat of this Kushite monarchy, the first which its monuments enable us to regard as properly historical, is placed by those monuments, as we have seen, in the southern tetrapolis of Babylonia. In that quarter, also, the oldest traditions made civilization enter from the sea. Accordingly, the city, which the oldest extant inscriptions seem to mark as the capital, was Her, now Muger, the furthest to the south of all cities of Chaldea. Its site, a little below 31 degrees north latitude, was no doubt originally on the shore of the Persian Gulf, and its ships are mentioned in the connection with those of Ethiopia. These days, scholars no longer considered Her, i.e. to have been the oldest Sumerian city, but the other data is still relevant. Mr. Philip Smith describes the early peoples of India and Iran and their subjugation by Caucasian invaders in earlier times. After a struggle which lasted for centuries, the Aryan invaders conquered the Kushite aborigines of Indian Peninsula and reduced them to the position of inferior castes. The Iranian branch of the Aryan invaders overran Media, eastern Sasania, Persia, i.e. Iran, and the fertile parts of Carmania, expelling from those countries or reducing the old Kushite inhabitants, whom the Iranian legends describe as men of black complexion with short and woolly hair. Finally, Mr. Smith discusses ideas taken from the Bible concerning ethnic classifications. He uses them to group the Canaanites of Palestine together with the lower Mesopotamians of Iraq. It appears to be very much, if not chiefly, by the test of color, that the ethnic table of Genesis X groups the children of Ham, i.e. Sham, the swarthy. By this test, the Canaanites of Palestine and Phoenicia, the Syro-Phoenicians, and other dark Syrians further north would be distinguished, on the one hand, from the lighter immigrants of the Hebrew race from the upper Mesopotamia, and on the other, from the white Syrians of Cappadocia. And this distinction confirms their migration from the native land of dark race, such as lower Mesopotamia. The dark races of the Syrian coast are alluded to in Homer and other classic authors who find Ethiopians on the Syrian coast. By 1871, the mainstream position on ancient history credited Negroes, whether called Kushites or Ethiopians, with the origin of material civilization. Whether in Sudan, Egypt, Canaan, Sumer, earliest Iran, or India, it was impossible to escape from Negro origins. Islamic scholarship. In the Middle Ages, the Arabic term Sudanese entered the literature. In the 7th century AD, the Arabs conquered Egypt and the rest of the North Africa. Equivalent in meaning to Ethiopia, Sudan was their main destination for black people. Ibn Khaldun was a Tunisian historian of the 14th century. Of white Berber origins, he was also a Muslim. Considered one of the best historians of all time, he discussed the Arab invasion of North Africa and gave details of what the conquerors found in West Africa. At the time of the conquest of northern Africa by the Arabs between 639 and 708 AD, some merchants penetrated into the western part of the land of the blacks, i.e. West Africa, and found among them no king more powerful than the king of Ghana. His states extended westwards to the shores of the Atlantic Ocean. Kumbi Sala, the capital of the strong, populous nation, was made up of 2 towns, and formed one of the greatest, best populated cities in the world. The author of the Book of Roger makes special mention of it, as does the author of Roads and Kingdoms. Al-Bakri was a Spanish geographer from the city of Granada. He wrote the Book of the Roads and Kingdoms in 1067. In this work is a description of the Emperor of Ghana's courtly ritual. He gives audience to his people, says Al-Bakri. He sits in a pavilion around which stands his horses, caparisoned in cloth of gold.
Behind him stand 10 pages holding shields and gold-mounted swords. And on his right hand are the sons of the princes of his empire, splendidly clad with gold plaited into their hair. The governor of the city is seated on the ground in front of the king, and all around him are his viziers, i.e. ministers, in the same position. The gate of the chamber is guarded by dogs of an excellent breed, who never leave the king's seat. They wear collars of gold and silver. Al-Idrisi, a Moorish geographer, wrote the Book of Roger. This work, as Ibn Khaldun suggests, contains an excellent account of ancient Ghana, but also the East African coast. Writing in 1153, he also gave a clear picture of the state of the Islamic geographical knowledge at the time. Results from the opinion of philosophers, learned men, and those skilled in observation of heavenly bodies, is that the world is as round as a sphere, of which the waters are inherent and maintained upon its surface by natural equilibrium, surrounded by air, and all created bodies are stable on its surface, the earth drawing to itself all that is heavy in the same way that a magnet attracts iron. The equatorial globe is divided into 2 equal parts by the equinoctial line. The circumference of Earth is divided into 360 degrees, each of 25 parasangs. Al-Masudi, a distinguished Arab historian from Baghdad, visited the East African coast in 916 AD. He documented his extensive travels in a book called Meadows of Gold and Mines of Gems. He described the Zanj, that is, East Africans, as having an empire spread over a large territory divided by valleys, mountains, and deserts. The inhabitants of people of Zenj, i.e. Zanj, extend to Sofala, i.e. Mozambique, which is the termination of voyages of mariners of Oman and Sirif. It is a land abounding in gold, rich in wonderful things, and very fertile. The Zenjs have chosen it for the seat of their empire and have placed at their head a king, whom they name Oklaman. This is the name, i.e. title, which the king of Zenj has borne throughout time. Iklaman, who is chief of all Zenj kings, marches at the head of 3,000 cavaliers. They are mounted upon cows. They have neither horses or mules. In 1331, Ibn Battuta, a Moroccan white Berber origins, visited the same region. Battuta's book, Travels in Asia and Africa, contains much that is useful, including the following account of his visit in the Tanzanian city of Kilwa. Night on the island of Mombasa, and then set sail for Kilwa, the principal city on the coast, that greater part of whose inhabitants of Zanj are very black complexion. They have tattoo marks on their faces like the Limian of Janata, i.e. West Africa. A merchant told me that a fortnight's sail beyond Kilwa lies Sofala, where powdered gold is brought from a place a month's journey inland called Yufi. Kilwa is one of the most beautiful and well-constructed cities in the world. The whole of it is elegantly built. He also left a detailed travelogue of his voyage to Mali in West Africa, covering some of the same places that Dr. Barth trekked 500 years later. Early 20th century scholarship. In 1905, Lady Lagarde wrote A Tropical Dependency. It was subtitled An Outline of Ancient History of the Western Sudan, with an account of modern settlement of northern Nigeria. This masterpiece synthesized the findings of Heron, Barth, Clapperton, Dubois, and the Islamic scholars previously cited. In this undertaking, she recovered the early history of Ghana, Mali, Shanghai, Kanem Borno, and Hostland. Among her many findings, she noted that it is interesting and remarkable that while Timbuktu undoubtedly dominated the life of Shanghai Empire and was the first town of the Sudan, i.e. that part of Africa, many other towns are almost equally noticed by travelers for their trade and for their learning of which they were center. Marmol, writing in the reign of Askia Dawadad, speaks of Malay, i.e. Mali, as not only rich in trade but also in learning, having its own scholars of science and religion. The writers of Timbuktu themselves made frequent allusions to learned doctors of Malay, Al-Walatan, i.e. Walata, Jenne, and Katsena. In Masina, also there were an immense number of distinguished men of letters and divines. Even the far distant Tekata is named as the seat in which El-Maghili chose to establish his school. In 1906, G.R.S. Mead wrote Thrice Greatest Hermes, subtitled Studies in Hellenistic Theosophy and Gnosis. The 3-volume masterpiece synthesized the findings of Manetho and Plutarch, as well as the work of various 19th century scholars such as Champollion. Mead's aim in writing the book was to elucidate the teachings of body of Egypto-Greek literature called the Hermetica. He traced the prototype of this literature to the Egyptian doctrines taught at the schools of Hermopolis, Memphis, and Heliopolis, As synthesized in the 8th century BC inscription in the British Museum, also called the Shabaka stone. In conclusion to the great work, Mead wrote the following: "And if we say that this wisdom has come down to us in Greek tradition, we should ever remember that this Graicizing or philosophizing has to do with form and not substance. For whence did Thales and Pythagoras and Plato draw the inspiration for their philosophy of love of wisdom? Was it not from Egypt? At any rate, so say the Greeks themselves without single dissenting voice. And can we think that the Greeks, who were always so proud of their own achievements and boasted their own genius so loudly, would have given the palm of wisdom to Egypt had they not been compelled by overwhelming evidence to do so?" In 1913, Captain Stegen wrote The Land of Zinj. It was subtitled Being an Account of British East Africa, its Ancient History and Present Inhabitants. This work was the first to synthesize the documentation concerning the history of the Swahili or Zanj. The captain explains the origin of this unusual word. This word, Zinj, meaning a black, was generally used to refer to the blacks of East African coast. Our word, Zanzibar, is derived from the Arabic Zangibar, meaning the country of the blacks. It was originally used to refer to the greater part of the coast, which was called the country of Zinj or Zenj, but is now restricted to the island of Zanzibar. Zenj, the Zingium of Cosmas and Zingis of Ptolemy, was originally south of Berbera country, as far as Sofla, roughly Juba River to Zambezi River. Though different writers assigned to different limits, the country of Berbera was situated between Absentia, i.e. Ethiopia, and Senj, and so consisted of the whole of Somaliland. Leo Weiner, a Harvard University philologist, wrote a provocative but well-received work entitled Africa and the Discovery of America. The presence of Negroes with their trading masters in America before Columbus is proved by the representation of Negroes in early American sculpture and design, by the occurrence of Black Nation at Darien in early 14th century, but more specifically by Columbus's emphatic reference to Negro traders from Guinea in West Africa, who trafficked in gold alloy, guanin, of precisely the same composition and bearing the same name, as frequently referred to by early writers in Africa. Weiner was a brilliant pioneer, but his work contains a major flaw. There are medieval documents that allude to these early African voyages to America, but none mention trading masters of a different race to the Negroes. Sir E. A. Wallace Budge, the great English Egyptologist, was the English translator of the Kebra Nagasti and other important documents from Ethiopia, i.e. the modern country of this name. In addition, he studied the written accounts of the country by Francisco Alvarez and the other Portuguese authors of the centuries ago. In 1928, Budge wrote A History of Ethiopia, Nubia, and Abyssinia. The 2-volume work mapped the history of Kush, medieval Nubia, and Ethiopia. Ethiopia had a long and eventful history ruling the cities of Yeha and then Aksum. Between 1180 and 1220 AD, they built a new capital called Roha, or Lalibela. Containing 11 churches still in existence, Dr. Budge commented on their architectural significance. Abyssinia, i.e. Ethiopia, contains the most remarkable churches in the world, which certainly deserve to be reckoned with the 7 wonders of the world. All who have seen them marvel, not at their beauty, but at the mind of the man who conceived their design, and the colossal labor which was expended in their making. The rock-hewn temples of Ramses II at Calabash and Abu Simbel cannot be compared with the churches at Lalibela, because no attempt was made to alter the shape of the hills of the sandstone out of which the temples were hewn, and to make the temples resemble independent buildings. Cecilia Hill, an English writer, penned a fascinating travelogue entitled Moorish Towns in Spain, published in 1931 and contained an excellent history of the Moorish civilization. In the introduction, she asks of the Moors, why were they so hated? Why did the Spaniards, when the passage of centuries they had learnt all that the Moors could teach them, strive with an ever-increasing animosity to drive them out, first from Toledo, then after a long interval from Cordova and Seville. Finally, after 2 more centuries of the struggle, from their last fort, Granada. It was inevitable. It was instinctive. The Moors were a colored race, and their occupation of a European country was an insult. They were heathens, i.e., non-Christians, and to suffer them was an offense before God. They were invaders, and they had no right to be in Spain. They occupied a valuable strip of seaboard and might assist a further invasion from Africa.
They were an obstacle to national unity and hampered participation in affairs of Europe. They were an irritating anachronism. They were a thorn in the flesh. In England in 1931, a colored race could only refer to Negroes. The Moorish civilization was hardly discussed by scholars back then, and thus Mrs. Hill's book was a welcome addition to the frame of reference. Coming full circle, Dr. Leo Frobenius, cited earlier, summarized his findings thus. Relations of the navigators of the 15th to 17th centuries give incontrovertible proofs that Negro Africa, stretching south from the edge of the Saharan deserts, was still in full flower. The full flower of harmonious and well-ordered civilizations. And this fine flowering the European conquistadors annihilated as far as they penetrated into the country. For the new country of America had need of slaves, and they were to be had in Africa. Hundreds, thousands, whole cargoes of slaves. However, the traffic in Negroes was never an affair of an entirely easy conscience. It demanded a justification, and so the Negro was made into a half animal, an article of merchandise. And for this reason, the notion of the fetish was invented as the symbol of an African religion, Portuguese, feticero. As for me, I have not seen in any part whatsoever of Africa the natives worshipping fetishes. The professor, while an extraordinary pioneer, revealed his limitations when he claimed that Negro Africa extended only as far north as the Sahara. There was already enough literature to prove otherwise. Whichever be the case, it should be clear that most of what is now known about black history was already known in European circles before 1936. By then, Darwin, the father of natural selection theory, had already argued that the human race was of African origin. Count de Volney, the father of Orientalism, had already shown that Negroes in Egypt and Sudan founded civilization. M. Jean-Francois Champollion, the father of Egyptology, had already argued that the ancient Egyptians were quite similar to the Canaanites or Barbaros, present inhabitants of Nubia. Sir Henry Rawlinson, the father of Assyriology, had already suggested that the Sumerians were Kushite or Ethiopian. Philip Smith proves that these ideas were in the British intellectual mainstream as it stood in 1871. In fact, he shows that the Kushites, whom the Iranian legends describe as men of a black complexion with short and woolly hair, founded earliest Iran and India. Rulers characteristic of the Negro ruled in Egypt, and a dark race, identified as Ethiopians, inhabited Palestine. Nor was Smith alone in this view. On page 592, we cite a French school book from 1907 that makes essentially the same points. Other European scholars have begun the mapping of later chapters of the African heritage. Mr. Bosworth Smith, as we have seen, documented the history of Carthage in 1877. After him, Mr. Wilmot wrote a history of Monhumetepa. Major Dubois penned a history and travelogue of the Shanghai Empire. Mr. Roth documented the primary source material on Great Benin. Lady Luggard penned the history of Ghana, Mali, Kanem Borno, and Hassaland, among others. Mr. Mead had shown the Egyptian origin of the ideas that became Greek philosophy and also Christian religion. Captain Stiggan wrote of the history and culture of the East African coast. Professor Wiener documented the African voyages to America before Columbus. Sir Wallace Budge published a history of Ethiopia and Nubia. Finally, Mrs. Hill penned a history of the Moors in Spain. The reader may well wonder why none of this information is common knowledge today, but in 1871 and 1907, most of it was in the mainstream. While the above is a small sample of literature that is out there, it is sufficient to demonstrate that what now masquerades as world history is largely fictitious. The key issue is that in 1871, only Europeans would have been reading this material. It was for their eyes only. The current make-believe histories that locate Europeans or Mediterraneans as the founders of civilization itself were fabricated over the last 100 years. This time, however, the material was aimed at a world readership. To pull this off, European scholars had to forget or pretend to forget all that they previously knew about Africans and their history. By the year 1900, European control over the world by colonial conquest was almost complete. In addition, they seized control over the media and educational systems of the world. Therefore, what the world learned about itself came from or through a European source. Consequently, only stereotypes of non-whites were ever going to escape the censorship. In the case of the Far East Asians, no scholarship ever located them as the original founders of civilization itself.
The mainstream could therefore tolerate Chinese history since it did not clash with the 20th century fabrication that Europeans were the original founders of civilization. The mainstream could not, however, tolerate black history. Thus, it became important for the propagandists, aka historians, to deny that the above literature ever existed, or if not, deny that the terms Ethiopians, Libyans, Cushites, Hamites, Moors, Zanj, and Sudanese refer to Negroes, unless, of course, such people were captured slaves. If that failed, the mainstream bitterly attacked the credibility of the ancient and modern scholars. This was not an entirely satisfactory approach, since European historical scholarship is itself built upon the foundations laid by Herodotus, De Volney, Dupuy, Sir William Jones, Champollion, Rowlandson, and Darwin. To attack these scholars was therefore equivalent to scoring an own goal. The final and most modern approach is to claim that modern authority is worth more than ancient documentation. It was all in vain because, as Leo Frobenius put it, the spell has been broken. Moreover, the buried treasures of antiquity again revisit the sun. We give the final word on this topic to Professor Yosef Ben Yochanan, an Ethiopian Egyptologist. This gentleman, one of the master teachers of our time, comments that this should have made you, the student, aware of the fact that there is a preponderance of historical evidence showing the Nubians, Ethiopians, Punites, Lebus or Libyans, Zimbabweans, and other Africans along the Nile valleys and African Great Lakes. It should have made you realize that there are thousands of volumes on the history of each of these African nations which have been purposely kept from students of history, all colors, for the past 2 centuries or more. Unfortunately, most of said volumes are alien to the most of our modern professors of history and anthropology, including those bearing the title Authority of Africa. This in no way excludes most Black studies professors. Thus, you are aware of the problems all of us face. That is, people who profess to speak authoritatively on Africa and things African without any knowledge of them except for certain aspects of the infamous slave trade.